Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Wills and Probate podcast. Today we're talking about Islamic wills. It's a specialist subject, definitely. There are cultural and religious and legal challenges around specialising in this particular area of the law. And I'm joined today by Mariam Khan, a solicitor at WMP Legal. Mariam, you're going to tell me more about who are you and what do you do in a second, but it's great to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Well, look, before we get into Islamic wills specifically, tell us about your practice, tell us about your role at WMP Legal.
Yep, I'm a solicitor at WMP Legal. We do Islamic wills, estate planning, both English and Islamic wills, inheritance tax. But my main focus is on Islamic wills because there's not many will writers out there or solicitors who actually specialise in this area of law.
We've had, of course, your principal, Nick, on the podcast once or twice before as well. It's great to have you on. First of all, then, how did you get into specialising in Islamic wills? And I guess we'll kind of lead on to then why it's important to specialise.
Okay, it's quite a long story, but I'll cut it and summarise it. When I was studying this area of law, Nick, who is principal and managing director, was my teacher at that time. So I joined his firm. We were in an exhibition in Birmingham where a solicitor approached me and said to me, why don't you do Islamic wills? And I did have an Islamic background. So when I was younger, I did study Islamic studies. Where my mum took me back home to Pakistan. I did 3 years of intensive studies on Islamic inheritance. And then I came back and said to Nick, let's start this. Then during the lockdown, just before the lockdown in March 2020, I realized that it's not as simple as it sounds, and I need to do a bit more in depth of training and more, so I need more knowledge on the complex cases. So Nick sent me back to Pakistan in March 2020 to do further education on Islamic laws of inheritance, which I did. I got stuck there during lockdown, but it was nice. The weather was nice as well, so definitely it was a good experience. Yeah, so in order to do Islamic wills, you need both English and Islamic laws of inheritance knowledge.
Well, that leads rather neatly on to my kind of first question, I suppose, which is why do you need to specialise in Islamic wills? How are they materially different from a will that isn't specifically Islamic?
So a generic or an English will, you have a testamentary freedom to write a will, giving your assets to anyone you wish to. And you can also exclude the people you wish to. Islamically, it's slightly different. I wouldn't say you don't have testamentary freedom, but you have to follow the guidelines according to the Quran. The Quran is the holy book, the religious book that we follow as a Muslim, and it's specified fixed shares in the Quranic book. So there's fixed shares for every single Muslim person. So for instance, if you're married, the shares would be your children, your husband, and your parents. So yes, you definitely need knowledge, intensive knowledge, in order to understand those principles and implement them in your will. There can be complex cases where they don't have the primary beneficiaries, then you have to go further and do more research on the secondary beneficiary and the third, and so on.
So when you're drafting this, you have to take into account both the jurisdiction in which you're in this case, England and Wales, and Sharia law, isn't it?
Absolutely, because you have to make sure that the will complies with the legal framework in the UK, but also the Islamic laws of inheritance. That's where it gets complicated sometimes. But absolutely, you need to be specialised in both areas of law in order to give your clients the best sort of advice, because Islamic wills does attract inheritance tax as well, because in terms of the shares, and I'm not going to go into more detail, but when you're specifying shares, your spouse receives a certain percentage, which means that usually you have wills where you give everything to your spouse, spousal exemption. In Islamic will, you need to put certain trusts in there in order to get those exemptions. So you definitely need to work out both English and Islamic.
So in terms of how that works practically, English will, you have to still sign it, make sure it's legally binding, that kind of thing. It needs to, as you say, comply with the law of the land. What are the key kind of differences then that you need to go into? I mean, I appreciate in a podcast like this, we're probably not going to do this all justice, but what are the key elements of an Islamic will that you need to consider?
Yeah, so I'll go the main key elements. Number one is in your Islamic will, you have funeral wishes. Now, obviously, in a generic English will, you have funeral wishes. But specifically in an Islamic law, we need to have a clause, or we must have a clause that is burial, because cremation is something obviously against the Islamic principle. So every Muslim must be buried. And then you have to also stipulate your funeral wishes, which is very important. There's a specific way for the funeral to take part. So it must be Islamic funeral according to Islamic traditions. No autopsy or embalming unless it's required. So you must have that clause in the will as well. So that's one aspect of Islamic will where we have clients who may not have assets but do write Islamic will to make sure that their funeral is done correctly according to their religion and the religious beliefs, and who don't have families in the UK, for instance. The secondly, and as I mentioned before, is that fixed shares that are in the Quran that we must specify. So those two things, the funeral wishes and the distribution of the estate, there's two things that must be correctly done once writing an Islamic will. So this is the difference. Having a guardian, absolutely, you must have a guardian in Islamic will, but same with English will. Executors, you must have executors in Islamic will, same as English will. You must be witnessed correctly, signed correctly. So all the elements are same, just that few of the elements you need to add on in order to make an Islamic will.
You said there about you need to have your burial wishes, for example, in the will. Perhaps I'm being a little bit naive here, but presumably the executor, who is likely to be a family member, as it is with most wills, is going to be well aware of those kinds of wishes. Or are we trying to sort of build into this a fail-safe in case there aren't executors who can enact your wishes?
Absolutely, you need to do that. The reason being is that some executors may not be family members. So we have clients who are here as employees, like doctors and nurses who come from abroad, do not have family members here. Or you have students, or you have, a husband and wife is working here, but they don't have any other family members. So the executors may not be Muslims. So it's good to have that in place so that there's certainty. There's always, it's good sort of, as I said, certainty is because some family members may not agree to that, even though they're Muslims. Cremation is maybe cheaper and all that. So have that certainty is to stipulate your funeral wishes, make sure it's done correctly so that there's no issue when you're gone, basically.
I suspect that people who are listening to this may well be sat there going, well, I understand the principle of having to comply with local law, but what happens when the laws of the country don't reconcile with Muslim teachings and principles? How do you deal with that?
So obviously this is why you need to write an Islamic will, so that when you die and when it goes to probate, it is gone according to the Islamic distribution. Rules of intestacy will apply. Obviously the family members will not inherit the Islamic distribution. So in order to prevent that, make sure that it's done correctly, this is why you need to write a will. Otherwise, as I said, it goes according to the rules of intestacy. Same with any other wills, generic English wills. People normally write the will in order to minimize inheritance tax, but also making sure that it does not go according to the rules of intestacy, it actually goes according to their wishes. So it's a similar sort of similarity, but for Muslims, it's very important because if you're in an Islamic country, Saudi, UAE, Pakistan, India, it's absolutely fine because there is automatically under the Islamic rules. So they follow that when you pass away. Because we live in a non-Muslim country, you need to write a will so that it goes according to your wishes. As in the UK, in this law, we have testamentary freedom. So you have the right or the freedom to give the assets to whoever you like. So the probate court, they happily accept the Islamic rules and they follow the percentage, the guidance that we put into the wills.
We all know that we should have a higher proportion of people who've got wills in the UK than we currently do. But would you say that the Muslim community does have a higher proportion of people with wills than perhaps other communities?
50. Initially, the rate of will writing in the Muslim community tends to be lower overall, as many individuals lack knowledge, understanding about the importance of writing a will itself, and that it aligns with both Islamic and legal obligations. However, having said that, for those aware of these requirements, the rate is increasing as they seek to ensure that it complies with the English and the Islamic law.
So as with English wills, is it the case that you can leave a proportion of your estate to somebody that isn't Muslim, for example, if you're following these Sharia rules?
Absolutely. So the 2/3 of your estate is according to the Islamic principles, so according to the Quran and the guidance that we get. 1/3 of your estate, you have the freedom to give it to anybody. So it can be a friend, it can be charity, a non-Muslim, non-inheritor can also inherit that, absolutely.
And I'm taking some of the context of the podcast here from an article that you wrote for today's Wills and Probate recently, Mariam, which was a really interesting piece on some of the do's and don'ts, I suppose, of what Islamic wills are and are not. You make a point in it about unperformed religious obligations, particularly Hajj and Zakat. How can you make provision for that in a will as well? And why is it important?
The provisions that you make into the will is stipulating it in specific gifts, for instance, or instruction for the executors. So usually what we make it to make it simple and for the person who's dealing with the probate at that time to understand how to follow that. So in terms of Hajj, we normally say that to perform Hajj, and we stipulate a certain percentage of the inheritance of the money into pot, so that the executors or the beneficiaries can use that money in order to perform Hajj. Same as charity. You know, when you're requesting charity in a specific gift, you're stating that I would like the sum of money go to a specific charity. Same you do with the Hajj, is that you state that I would like to leave £12,000 for my executors to perform Hajj on my behalf, or they can appoint somebody to perform Hajj on my behalf. Hajj is a pilgrimage where it is an obligation on a Muslim to perform once a lifetime. Hajj is quite expensive, but if you haven't performed it during a lifetime, you can stipulate that in your will, so that once you've gone and once your assets have been sold out into a pot, they can actually utilize your assets, and then the family members, executors can go ahead and perform the Hajj, which means that you get, as a Muslim, our belief is that once we passed away, if we leave good deeds to do something good, we'll get continuous reward once you're gone. Zakat is a charity. So every Muslim who earns a certain amount per year must pay charity. So every single Muslim would pay charity during their lifetime. So if you haven't paid charity for a few years in your life, maybe, then you stipulate that in your will, stating that I would like this amount to go to this charity. Yeah. So these are the obligations that we must have. I must make sure that we tick the boxes before we go.
If it's not sort of too general a question, Mariam, how do people find out about you specifically specialising in Islamic wills, and how have you built up your practice around this?
Initially, it was difficult. I started back in 2018. At that time, it's pre-COVID, so it wasn't really online sort of stuff. It was sort of more than I used to go into different mosques and community centres and do lots of workshops, workshops and seminars, and radio. I went on radio as well, BBC Cambridgeshire and the Islam radio in Peterborough area, just to spread that knowledge. The first instance was that we need to spread that knowledge so that they understand what's the importance of it according to the English law and Islamic. And then once I've done that, then that's how they start to approach me, and everyone's clients start to build up. And then obviously the lockdown happened. I start doing free legal clinics on Facebook. whilst I was in Pakistan. So I used to get some questions and I used to log on for an hour, half an hour, 15 minutes, once or twice per week. And I used to answer loads of people's questions. And I think that's rotated and I got a lot of client following from that. And then I moved on to LinkedIn and get so from there as well. The new trend nowadays is TikTok. I upload some videos on TikTok on Islamic rules and just spread the knowledge. So once the other person understands what the importance is, that's when they start approaching you.
So is it the case that, for example, there are a lot of Muslims in the UK who have got English wills and simply don't have provision for, the conversation we've had today?
Yes, there are many who have English wills who have, who actually understood that how important to write a will is, and they do have those wills. However, I tend to get clients who've written wills 20 years ago, 15 years ago. Their children have grown up, so they need to update their will. So in order to update it, we'll draft up a new will according to Islamic provision. If they do have a will, what I suggest then is that obviously I don't tend to review their existing will if I'm not making a new will, but I do suggest them to have these Islamic principles and they can update their will, go back to their solicitors and update the will. This is why my videos and clinics are quite beneficial for those who don't understand the Islamic law of inheritance. They can implement that, or they just ask me questions and they'll go back to their solicitors and then they can update that. Because I do get a lot of clients from Scotland because we don't cover the jurisdiction. I'll give them some backup knowledge or some information in regards to the inheritance point of view, and then go back to their solicitors and let's draft their wills that way. We do get clients who are expats, so who are living in Saudi, Qatar, Dubai, lots of assets in the UK, and we usually do their Islamic wills.
And for practitioners who are approached by members of the Islamic faith who are looking for support with this, said that you kind of provide quite a lot of content around that. Do you work with sort of people locally to you or nationally on that basis and have referrals to you as well?
Yes, nationally, absolutely. We do have partnership with different law firms, different mortgage advisors, accountants, financial advisors, and where their clients require Islamic rules, they refer the clients to us.
Whilst we've probably only touched the surface of some of the challenges and opportunities, I suppose, that Islamic wills presents, it's been great to have you discuss your work, discuss your own practice, and I guess at the end of the day, actually inform practitioners about some of the nuance of Islamic wills as well. So thank you so much for joining the podcast, Mariam.
You're most welcome, David, and thank you so much for having me.
Today's Wills and Probate podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todayswillsandprobate.co.uk. My thanks to Mariam. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.